It's time for the Blazor Power Hour.
Welcome to the Blazor Power Hour.
Introducing the Blazor Power Hour.
No, seriously, it's time for Blazor Power Hour.
Hey friends, it's time for the Blazor Power Hour.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the Blazor Power Hour.
You're checking out the Blazor Power Hour.
Welcome to the Blazor Power Hour.
It's Blazor Power Hour. Go Ed!
Are you ready? Are you set? Got everything all ready to go? Let's do it. Let's do the Blazor Power Hour.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Blazor Power Hour, where the introduction is always better than the content. I'm your host, Ed Charbonneau, and today we're going to talk about layout in Blazor. And I wrote an article about this and posted on my blog just Monday this week, and I wanted to go through some of the samples that are in this blog post. I'll share the blog post here in chat as well. So let's start things off. And John Cat says, good morning. Good morning, John. Welcome to the show. Let's start things off with a little history of where this article comes from. This is going to be a lot of personal opinion of mine, which is why I posted on my blog. I always believe that you should use web standards before you go to like frameworky things. I don't care if you're in Blazor, you're in React, you're in Angular. If you're on the web, I gravitate towards web standards, and then when the web standards run out of steam, then I move to framework features and so on. So while there are, quote, actual layout components in Blazor, these are generally just components that are designated as layout pages. When people are searching for these layout components, what they're actually looking for, in my experience, is they want something that kind of relates to the XAML world. And I'll zoom in on my XAML example here. And I grabbed these examples from the .NET Docs website. There's an excellent tutorial in there about how to do layouts in XAML in like UWP, for example. And Rick says hi, by the way. Welcome, Copperbeardy, as well. So in XAML, you have this very verbose way of writing how you want to display something in a grid layout. There's also a stack panel layout, which we'll get into as well. But people are coming from other .NET ecosystems looking for these grid layout and stack panel components, and they're not finding them in Blazor. Hey, Marin, welcome to chat. Marin's one of our support folks from the Telerik team, by the way. If you see him in chat there, make sure you give him a shout out. He answers all the support questions for our Telerik UI for Blazor product. So a lot of folks are looking for these. A lot of Xamarin developers here, .NET works in the browser now. They come over and they're shocked to find no grid component. And again, for good reason. I wrote an article about this called 10 Blazor features you probably didn't know. And feature number 1 is that Blazor can do anything that HTML and CSS can do. This is a very important thing for me. Again, web standards first is my approach that I like to go with. So let's get into what this web standard is. So we don't have a grid element, for example, in HTML. There's a table element. We used to use those years and years ago for layouts. Those are not the same thing. Those are supposed to be used for data. There is, however, a CSS grid that is available for layouts and is designed for doing layouts. So I took this example from the Docs website. Let's actually grab that Docs website too so we can follow along on both of these things. We've got, I think it's near the end of the article, we've got a link to that as well. If I can find that wonderful example, I may have, here we go. The UWP grid layout tutorial is also what we're following along with here. So if you follow the one for UWP, they show you how to define a grid, and you come up with a kind of a layout like this. You add some stack panels, and then the end result is this nice little weather widget looking thing. So I went through this example and I was like, all right, can I translate this to the web and do it in a way that it closely resembles this grid layout that we already have in UWP? How close or how different are those tools? Let's see. How did you guys find time to know this stuff? And is there easy resource to get? Yeah. So I shared the link in chat. I believe I'll share it again. The article I wrote is here. And if you go to that article, excuse me for 1 second. Sorry, I was losing my voice there for a minute. If you go to that article, and I'll scroll down here and show you where this information is at. There are resources in this article on where I read up on some of these details. All of these links are going to point you to CSS Tricks. CSS Tricks is just really an excellent go-to resource for this type of stuff. So I just quoted some of their articles here that you can go find and learn in depth about these things. So that's where I learned about them. And then I have some .NET background knowledge. So I was able to take this grid, this XAML grid, and compare it to what the equivalent looks like in CSS. So there's some one-to-one comparisons that we can do here that I think most people would find fairly intuitive. So in the web, we don't define the layouts in line like we do in XAML. So we do use CSS, and we use this in conjunction with our HTML. So that's going to be one of the main differences here. But other than that, the definition of how this grid is laid out is about the same. So you'll see in this CSS selector, we're going to select an element, and we're going to set it to display grid. And this is very similar to what's happening here. So we're going to say this main layout element is going to be our grid. We're going to set the height of that grid to the entire view height. That's what VH stands for, the view height of the page. And then this part lines up very, very closely with what you see above, where our grid template columns are going to be 3 fractions and for the first column and 5 fractions for the second column. And this is actually the same type of definition up here. So you can see we have 3 fractions for the first column. They use a star annotation in XAML versus FR on the web. And then we have our 5 here. So these two pieces of code about say the same thing. This template column, when you see the word template here, this means we're going to have one template iteration. When you see auto here, this means we're going to repeat those columns or rows. So I'm going to use auto for the rows. So every repeating row repeats this pattern. And this pattern is going to be the same as what's defined up here. We have a height of 2 and then a height of star. This star, this default value here, when you do not have a number designated in front of the star, is going to equate to 1 star, which in the HTML world is 1 fraction. Okay, so we've got that same definition down here. We're 2 fractions by 1 fraction. And we're going to repeat those rows in that type of a pattern. So let's get a visual on that. Let's scroll down a little bit. Once we have our CSS defined and we apply this class to our main layout, any div that gets rendered within this class follows that template pattern of 3 fractions wide for the first column, 5 fractions wide for the second column, and then the first row will be 2 fractions, so twice as large as the second row. And it's going to repeat this pattern over and over. So let's go ahead and run this. I've got a code pen here. Again, this is just HTML. This isn't really a Blazor thing so much as it is just a web thing. Let's see, we can view this on CodePen here. If you have a link to that article, by the way, you can just jump right into the CodePen and look at this on your screen as well. So it doesn't matter how many of these divs that I render inside of my grid, they are going to line up with the proper layout. And you can see here, this is flexible as well. So if I change the width, those columns auto resize to fit that window because they're using that fractional value. They're not set at a specific pixel width. They're just fractions of what is available. If I came up here and live edited this and changed, say, the first column to 1 and the second column to 1, since they're both the same value, I get like a 50-50 split here. So I've now split the screen into 2 columns. And then you can see my automatic rows here repeating. If I wanted these to be the same size, for example, I could remove one of these values. And now they're all the same height. Or I could change that to be a different height. So now we've got the basic concept of a grid component. Even though there's not a physical grid component that we would render in Blazor, you can see it's just a static piece of HTML. It's just a div. We don't have a like an open bracket grid like we do in XAML. It's handled by CSS instead with this display grid property. So that's how we do CSS Grid. So let's put some concepts together a little bit. And this is just the very tip of the iceberg for Grid. You can do some really crazy stuff with the Grid. Let's talk about that real quick before we get into Flexbox. This responsive grid magazine layout and 20 lines of CSS article that I linked from my blog post shows you how to create a very complex layout. And what I really like about this is there are code pens that are very nicely put together that show how to do these really complex grid layouts and how the individual grid elements are rendered to the screen. You can see that he numbers them and everything, so you can see where each element ends up landing in this grid as he builds out this magazine style layout that's also responsive for mobile. So really good stuff here. This gets a lot more in depth, but it just shows how flexible this type of styling can be. And notice we haven't mentioned anything like Bootstrap or any of that stuff as well. So we're not going to pull in any like third-party CSS tools. There's no Sass. There's no magic here. This is all web standard stuff. So I like this approach. Flexbox is another piece of this puzzle of doing layouts in .NET, or sorry, in Blazor. And if you're coming from a .NET background like XAML or UWP or Xamarin, you're probably familiar with something called a stack panel. So stack panel is the close equivalent to CSS Flexbox. And it's handled quite a bit the same way as stack panel in XAML is. So let's do a little comparison here. Again, let's see, I might need to zoom out just a tad bit to catch all of this into one screen, but we'll do our best here. I'll use my little magic annotation tool. And let's start with what defines a stack panel. We have a stack panel element in XAML. We don't have that in HTML. Instead, we jump over to CSS and we target something on our DOM with a selector, and we set that to display flex. So these two things are pretty much one and the same here. Display flex and stack panel. So display flex is going to tell the browser anything that you display inside of this element, any child of this element, is going to follow a flexible layout. And what's nice about this is we can set the flex direction to column or row, and that's going to let the reflow go in either a horizontal direction or a vertical direction. And in Xamarin, or just XAML, I guess, in general, Xamarin Forms, all of those things, we have a horizontal align. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong one. Where is it? Orientation, horizontal. And in Flexbox, we have display direction row. So it's row or column. And then we have a lot of the alignment features as well. So in stack panel, you have vertical and horizontal alignment. And in Flexbox, you have justify content. And you also have, I don't think I needed it in here because it's by default. Oh, no, here we go. Align items. So align items is going to be the vertical alignment. So align is going to be the vertical, and justify is going to be the horizontal alignment for these things. So there's a little bit of different syntax here between the two, but functionally they have the same output. So we can align things horizontally, we can align things vertically, we can display them in a column, or we can display them in a row. So all of these things match up here. We have also in here margins, and there's some row spanning and things like that, which we'll talk about in the next example. But the margins here, you can perfectly easily set margins in a Flexbox, and it will pretty much perform the same way as this setting here. So we have a gap setting in Flexbox that is it's a little bit easier to use, in my opinion, than setting margins on these items. Gap is a little more intelligent because it understands like first and last item already. So you can imagine if you set a margin on something, that the last item, even though you don't want it to have a margin, is going to have one unless you specify that the last item doesn't have that white space in it. Gap does all of that for you. So we'll set a gap to 20, and this will make a lot of sense when we look at the live example. And then again, when we apply this stuff, this looks a lot like the markup we have above, minus all of the style definitions that are applied to it. So we have a div. This one is a vertical stack panel. And then we have another div, and this is a horizontal stack panel. And every item inside of these is going to stack either vertically or horizontally. And if we look at this in our CodePen, this is the results that we get. So the first vertical stack panel here is repeating the inner child elements vertically, and then we're aligning those elements to the center. And you can control things like background color, etc., make those look however you'd like. The second item here displays horizontally, so each item, each child within this container is going to display left to right. You can change those orientations as well if you wanted right to left. And then you can see the gap setting here. I'm going to remove this for a second just to show what gap actually does. See how these items are all crammed tightly together here. That gap is going to set. It's going to set a imaginary boundary between these, and we can control the distance of those as well. So excellent question here. Is there a good way to pick up screen size so you can adapt devices depending on device? Yes, there's two ways to do that. First of all, you want to use CSS media queries as much as possible to do that. If you need to do something at runtime, there is a component that I have on NuGet called Blazor size, and I'll link you to the GitHub page here. Thank you, Emmanuel, for the question. Again, rule of thumb here is CSS media queries first, and then use Blazor size when media queries cannot do what you need them to do. For the most part, media queries should do everything. There are some use cases where you want to do things at runtime where Blazor size jumps in and helps you out. Some of those things are for example, if you wanted to change the UI components completely, like you want to render, there's an example in Blazor size to show you this, but if you have, say, a table, and then when you're on mobile, you want to show cards instead of that table, that would be very hard to accomplish with media queries cleanly. You could do it. You could do it. It would be very messy code-wise. You would be delivering a lot of HTML and CSS to the client that they just don't need. That can be troublesome on mobile where you have limited bandwidth and whatnot. So what you can do is you can use Blazor size, and it will check the device size, and then you just render the component that applies to that screen size, only sending them the bits that they need. So great question, very topical as well. You'll see here a lot of these Flexbox and grid elements are already very responsive friendly, so they resize automatically. The reason they do that is both Flexbox and grid are designed to use these fractional units, or they fill the entire space. So it's like automatic scaling here. Everything is scaled to the parent element, and it's going to resize automatically for you. So this is kind of Flexbox in a nutshell. Again, this flex direction is going to be the key element here. I think a lot of people are going to look for, if I set row to column, then you can see how those elements lay out quite differently, either vertical or horizontal. And that's just with one simple change, it will do that for you. There, again, are a lot of settings for Flexbox. And in my article, I linked to one very helpful CSS tricks article that is going to take you through pretty much every scenario there is. And there's also this excellent poster that you can buy if you want to pin something like this up. I love cheat sheets like this. I don't have any up in the office at the moment, but when I was in a cubicle situation, I had a ton of these things around my office to remind me, git commands and those type of things. So nice poster there to hang up. And what's awesome about this is it takes you through all of the different scenarios of ordering, what direction you can set Flexbox in, left to right, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top, how it wraps. I mean, you can style this thing every way you can imagine. You can set how those items start and end. Oh, hey, Eagle's here. Eagle, how did your show go, my friend? I was in Eagle's show, checking out what he was talking about with B-Unit and testing Blazor components just before the show started here. So if you are not already following Eagle on Twitch, make sure you click on Eagle's name there and you'll get a little follow button that'll take you to his show whenever it starts. Again, one of the things that always throws me just a little bit is when we're talking about horizontal alignment, we use the word justify. And when we're talking about vertical alignment, it's just align. So align items, you can align, you can not only align the content, this is your vertical alignment here, but you can also align the individual items and how they land within Flexbox. This can be super helpful as well. Stretch gives you a lot of really interesting options that you can use for layout. This is helpful for keeping items all the same size. As you can see here, like if you had different amounts of content within some cards or something, you can stretch those so they all appear the same size. And then there's the self-align as well, so you can move things about the layout, whether it's up and down. This is helpful. You can do this in grid as well, in case you don't want the item to start at the beginning of the grid cell. You want the inner content to shift to the end. So again, this document alone is a lifesaver. You can find a link to that in my article as well. That'll take you through all of the properties available there. So finally, we get to this like grand solution here. And again, I'll jump back to docs.microsoft.com where I found this. This is a tutorial to use grid and stack panel in a Xamarin or UWP application. UWP was the example here. And again, you walk through and it sets up this this grid layout. You get your stack panels and you put those inside of your grid. Then you pop a weather icon and there you go. You've got this nice little weather widget that you can use in your app. And it shows you kind of the full gambit of grid layout. So if we examine this guy a little bit here, what we're looking at is in this pane, we have a grid. So we have a grid here. That grid is broken down into two rows. There's a row here and a row here. And there are also two columns. We have a column here. And we have a column here. Okay. And in this layout, we're spanning two columns. So this part of the widget, it occupies two columns of the grid. This is in cell 1. This is in cell 2. This one occupies cell 1 and cell 2 of the second row. So meta question from Eagle here. I get this one a lot, so this is a great question. This tool is very old school, but if it gets the job done, it's absolutely the best tool for the job. It's Zoom It. And I think Microsoft scooped this up at some point because so many people in the org were using it. So if you just Google Zoom It, you'll find docs.microsoft.com. It's under sysinternals. Just grab that. This is something that has been around for quite some time, and I still get a lot of questions on where it is and how I found it. I think years ago I saw Scott Hanselman using it, and then I completely forgot about it, and then I was doing something as a presentation at like a meetup, and somebody's like, why don't you just use Zoom It? And I was like, what is that? And then they showed me, and I was like, oh, I think I remember seeing this a long time ago. This is cool stuff. Oh, is he really? So apparently he's CTO of Azure. That would be Mark. I'm trying to remember his last name. It's been too long since an MVP summit has happened in person. Usually we get to see Mark talk about Azure. But yeah, I think you're right there, Eagle. So we've got this grid, and it's again 2 by 2 columns wide, 2 rows tall, and we've got a span across those 2 columns. So to repeat this in HTML versus UWP here, let's look at our definition in UWP really fast. So our XAML grid, we've got our grid component. And everything about that grid is inlined here. We talked about this one very early on. It's three fractions wide. So when you see 3 star, that's 3 fractions by 5 fractions. That's your 3 by 5 columns. And then we've got the first row is twice the size of the second row is basically what this is saying. So the first row is 2 fractions. The second row is 1 fraction. So Eagle's talking about some of the tooling here, and you'll see me annotate on the screen. If I hold Control, I get a box. If I hold Control and Shift, you get an arrow. If you hold Shift, you get a line. If you hold Tab, you get a circle, and so on. So there's lots of interesting annotations you can pull off with this thing. So that's how you see me drawing all these examples on the screen. So 3 by 5 by 2 by 1. So 2 columns split 3 by 5, 2 rows split 2 by 1. So we've got our grid and column ratios set up here. There's some styling. We won't really talk too much about that right this minute. These things can be styled a million different ways. Interesting to see that you do it all in line here in XAML. You would not want to do that in HTML. That is very bad practice. This stack panel is inside of the grid. So this is inside. You can see the start and end tags here. So you can have a grid with a stack panel inside. You can have a grid with a grid inside with a stack panel in that. These things can nest with, infinite possibilities. There's nothing that says that these are mutually exclusive in any way. So make sure that you use all of these things to get your layouts where you need them. These are your CSS superpowers now. So we've got a grid with a stack panel inside. And then stack panel, again, these things are either just vertical or horizontal layouts. So these are nice and easy. We already looked at this part. This is our vertical stack panel. This is our horizontal stack panel. And then we have an image here. And that image, where does this image go? So this one was interesting as I read through the docs. This is one of the little rules that I found that is polar opposite in UWP as it is in HTML. So this image has no grid spanning or any other information about where it belongs, yet somehow it ends up, it's in the other article here, it ends up in this upper left-hand quadrant, sorry. Don't know my right from my left here. This has no defining information about where it belongs in the grid. And if you read through this section, there's a little bit of text here that says, because we want the image in the first row of the first column, we don't need to set a grid row or grid column attribute because the default is 0. So by not defining a grid location in UWP, it will automatically default to 0, 0. So the coordinates will be 0, 0 in the grid. HTML is completely the opposite here. So in HTML, when we put these elements in our document, they will render in the order they are found in the source code unless otherwise specified. So if we write our HTML in this manner on a CSS grid, this image will appear in the bottom corner instead of the top corner because it is last in the source code. So the default value for HTML is to render in the next location available, whereas in .NET, in XAML, it is to render at the default of 0. So big difference there. They're polar opposites, so that's just pretty easy to remember, I think, because they're just the inverse of each other. So if we look at this layout here, we have grid, stack panel, and grid. We need a similar thing in CSS, so we need a grid container. We're going to say display grid. We'll template out our columns. We're going to have a vertical stack panel and a horizontal stack panel, or Flexbox for CSS folks. So we're going to have a vertical Flexbox here. We'll set the flex direction to column. And then we're going to justify center those items so they line up vertically and horizontally. And then here's a new term we're going to learn here for the horizontal stack panel. So we're looking at this second section here where it's spanning across these two columns of the grid. And again, if I draw this out, we have a 2x2. We have 4 quadrants here. And they are like this. So our bottom needs to have, needs to not only be in grid location 1, but we don't want to split this up. We want it to occupy both of those cells, both 1 and 2 of this grid on the second row. I'm new to CSS. Does the order of the CSS make any difference? The order of the CSS makes all of the difference. So remember that. The order within, if these are different values, the order does not matter. If you were to write the same property twice, the second time you write it, that property value will win. So these will continuously override each other as you go down the source code. So we have our grid, and our grid is 2 columns wide. So we want the second stack panel, or the second flex box, to span the entire width of that grid. So what we have is a little syntax here. This one gets a little tricky for me. We can define this a couple different ways. There's actually 3 ways that I know of that you can write this same piece of code. This is the one that I chose to demonstrate here. But basically what this says is row 1, or the first row, I want to start at 1. And then I want, column. I wrote row, I meant column. Let's do this again. So I mixed up row and column here, and I don't want to confuse folks. This is going to say column start at 1 and span 2 columns. So I'm going to occupy these from column 1 through 2 more including column 1, I want to span across 2 columns. You can also write where you want to start and where you want to end. And that would look like this. And I'm getting my hotkeys broken here. Again, there's several ways you can write this. You can say, I want to start at column 1 and end at column 3. This seems a little counterintuitive because you have to add a +1 here at the end. I'll give you a little reasoning as to why this is. You might expect this to be 1/2 because you want it to be the first and second column. But what you're saying here is I want to start at the first column and end at the third column, which means I'm going to occupy column 1 and 2, but not 3. So visually, this makes sense. When you're writing code, you're not in the same context, and you're like, I want to occupy these 2 spaces, and you end up with 1/2, and then you go back to your rendered view, and it's wrong. You can also name columns in a grid, and you can actually give them text-based names. This is probably a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to cover today, but you could essentially have a template that looks something like this. You could say that this area of my grid is designated for the weather, and it's going to span 2 columns. So it's going to be weather twice. And column A and column B, or 1 and 2, are assigned to weather. Therefore, it spans 2 columns because I wrote it twice. There's reasons I won't get into that this was not a good choice for some of the examples. It's a little bit too rigid, I think. Numbers seem to be a little more flexible if I need to make some quick changes where the specificity of naming these things makes them extremely rigid. So if you go back, say you add another element, you need to go back and redefine that rigid pattern that you defined through text. So it can get a little messy. This is our horizontal panel. And then we go to our weather symbol, which is the equivalent to this graphic that I showed here. And again, remember, there is no default of 0, 0 in CSS. Instead, you have to literally define where you want this to be in the grid if it is not in the order of the source code where it needs to render. So I'm going to say that I want it in the upper left-hand corner, which is grid location column 1 and row 1. And that is going to only span 1 column. And there's some defaults here. I didn't need to really be so explicit with the span portion of this. I could have just said 1, 1, and that should just work fine. But I wanted to show how specific you could be with this. And we're going to put this up in the left-hand corner. So we can move these out of source order. When I say source order, I mean the order in which they're defined in the source code here. You'll notice that the weather symbol is at the last position in the source code, yet it's rendered in the first position in the grid because I'm telling the grid to take it and move it up to that section. So I can move items throughout the grid however I'd like and break this natural flow of the document. So we're really used to things in HTML and CSS flowing with the document, and CSS Grid and Flexbox allow us to actually move things about the page. You can even overlap elements in the grid using these coordinates. So you can get really creative with this stuff, but if we go up to CodePen and take a look at this, we can get a little better visual as to how this all lays out. You can see I've got my weather icon up here in the first set of columns. My second set of columns has a vertical stack panel, or a column-based flexbox, and then I have a row-based flexbox at the bottom that spans both of those columns. If I were to come in here and change some of these values, for example, if I comment out this this item here, you can see that it defaults to just this next position. So we have defined that this position is occupied. This one is next in source code and it's occupied. So the DOM will find the next available position in the grid and place the item there. So if we had yet another item, if I duplicate this and drop it in, it will now occupy this next space here as well. So it'll keep doing this grid layout as long as we add elements at that hierarchy to the grid. So let's go ahead and move this back to the way it was. We'll go back to the weather symbol here, and let's go ahead and see what that was without any grid column definitions. What does that look like? Since it is last in the source code, now you can see this is first, and it is it doesn't have any values to span any of the columns, so it ends up in column 1. Nothing ends up in column 2 because the next element available needs 2 columns to span, and it says to start at column 1 and span 2 columns. So it's going to still occupy both of those. This being the last item in source, it's now rendered at the bottom because we haven't given it grid coordinates. So we go back and we can say, give me grid 1, span 1, and go ahead and span the entire row there. And then we can justify then the vertical height and width to make it center within that column, similar to the way we're doing here. So these are ways that you can bring layouts into your Blazor application. It's not really a component thing. The reason it's not a component thing is because it's already built into HTML. Therefore, we're not going to repeat all of this functionality that's already built into the browser and wrap just syntactic sugar around it for the sake of having a grid element that we can define, or a grid component we can define in Blazor. So you won't see Blazor layout components like grid or like stack panel in the native framework. You may see some of these type of things come to something like TellerQI for Blazor at some point, just because there are folks that don't want to write CSS. They want to buy a component package that has this type of product in it. And we may add something like that to make those folks happy. But if you are on the web platform, please embrace some of these basic features that are already there and let you do these advanced layouts. I've got one more example here that we can look at. I've got about 10 more minutes. I'm happy to take questions as well if you want to have me try something here. I've got a much more advanced demo as well. So this might look familiar if you looked at the blog post that I showed you earlier. This is my home page. I decided to take Bootstrap out of my my blog. I haven't quite got there yet. I've gotten started. But I've been able to do this so far with not only no Bootstrap, but no other third-party tooling, so no Sass or anything. This is all HTML and CSS. And these advanced layouts that I created for my blog at one point are now much easier to do. And this is all using grid and flex boxes. There's multiple grids here, multiple flex boxes at play, and some CSS variables as well to do some styling and theming. So there's a lot of code that is being reused, and it's all CSS. There's no Sass source code in here making any of this magic happen. So this has been really interesting. Here's those media queries we talked about earlier taking effect. You'll notice as I scroll this down, I'll hit a breakpoint, and we'll start moving some of these elements to different grid positions, or even changing some of the grids themselves to make sure that we don't end up with something that's unreadable by the user. You'll see these the title in the card column also expand out when they get to the point where both of those columns can occupy the same space. And you'll also see these two centered images here that are butted up against each other go into a stacked mode in different screen resolutions. These are all being driven by media queries. This is all HTML and all CSS. There's no Blazor here. There's no JavaScript, nothing making this stuff happen. It's all just embracing web standard tech. If we took a look at this page, there's some pretty complex layouts happening. And there is an offset, purposely offset element here. So you could see this has down the center of the screen. This is about a 50-50 split. So we've offset the menu slightly here, and the footer does the same thing in the opposite direction. So we kind of have a line of sight that travels down the page. I'm trying to get a proper zoom on this here. So we have kind of a line of sight that travels this way throughout the page that kind of creates a direction for the user to kind of flow their the way they're reading the page. And this also plays a little bit on mid-century design, where you have items that project outward from kind of a symmetric pattern. So the symmetry on the page is really divided down the center line here, but you have kind of these elements that jet out from that symmetry. So to do this in a CSS grid, this is actually broken down into several grids here. And you could see if we're debugging these grids, this is also a nice experience that you don't get when you're using something like a Bootstrap layout or some of the traditional display float layouts that those CSS frameworks are written from. When you use CSS Grid, you get a nice grid pattern up here if you just click on this grid button in your DOM when you're inspecting the page. And you can see I've split up this section of the page into these columns here, and I'm spanning across them. So the logo is spanning 2 rows by 5 columns this direction. The menu spans 3 rows and the remaining 7 columns, so you get that offset. And then the next line down, the next section here within the same grid is yet another grid. So we're nesting these grids here. And then this one, let's turn that one off. We'll turn this one on. This is a grid within that first grid that is a 1 row by 2 column grid. So I have this first row, or sorry, column 1 and column 2. And what's interesting about this is normally the items flow from left to right. So this picture image should be here. But instead, I'm telling CSS to go ahead and set the start point of that image here so it aligns to the center and butts up against this other panel. And again, you can completely control how these elements float within in the grid items just through some simple properties. And this one was, I think it's self-align. Yeah, so justify self, flex end. Again, justifies horizontal. So on the horizontal axis here, the item within the cell, the self item, is going to flex end. And if I change this in the DOM, you can actually see auto is going to be the default position. We could center it, and then we have flex end, and that moves it to the end. So we have a way of doing flex start is the same as what is automatically inherited. So you can see we can move these things around the page in that manner. So we have total flexibility there. So that's how this is all accomplished with this layout. And you can also see a flex box, aka a stack panel in UWP with the menu here. This is actually a flex layout. So if I look at my nav class here, or rather the wrapper, do I have the, see, it's sorry, yeah, there we go. We have display flex on this set of menu items. So those will move in that flex pattern there. So they handle themselves by spreading out in a row. They have a gap to keep them aligned properly. And then as we scroll the page down, you can see how they flex layout, and they wrap without having any issues. The rest of the page follows the same type of a pattern. These are all just different sets of grids or flex boxes within this layout. There's no bootstrap here, no crazy nuclear codes to make this all work. And it's fully responsive because of media queries. Got about 5 minutes left. I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to jump back to an original question, again by ShotCare, that was asking about the order in CSS. And then ShotCare's got a new question as well, or statement here. Going with straight CSS or using Tailwind. Do you have an opinion on going with Tailwind? No, that's not too off topic. That's actually a great question. So I've heard really good things about Tailwind. I will say one thing about not only Tailwind, Bootstrap, I actually use Bootstrap from time to time. There's nothing wrong with these frameworks. They're great, especially if you're a beginner and you're getting started and you don't have a lot of experience with CSS. They're great platforms for a jumping off point. They're going to save you a lot of time in the long run. There's nothing wrong with using those things. I will say, however, with both Bootstrap and Tailwind, Tailwind uses, I think it's post CSS. So there are third-party tools that you're going to find that the code that you write with these frameworks isn't necessarily CSS code. It's going to be something with an added layer of functionality on it. So like Sass or post CSS, depending on which framework you choose. Yeah, that's an excellent point. I totally agree. They're great for prototyping. It's about getting stuff done, right? If you're proficient with these things, then by all means, this is the way to go. Bootstrap, I can prototype out a page in minutes with Bootstrap, where writing Scratch CSS code is probably not ideal if I'm trying to get something done quickly. These things are great. They are going to add additional tooling. A lot of times you're going to want to have something like NPM and some CSS Sass compiler or post CSS scripts that run on top of the code that you're writing. So there is a little bit of added complexity to these type of things. But I totally agree with this statement that these are excellent starting points and quick starts and prototypes. One thing that I'm a big advocate of is using these things to prototype. And then I know there's tools out there like, what's that thing called? There's some Adobe tooling and some other tools for prototyping that I know are really big. But if you're pretty proficient with the DOM and doing things in HTML, you can do prototyping inside of the browser as well. You can move things around. This is not a great example. I'm breaking stuff as I talk about it here. But for example, if I wanted to move the title and the paragraph around, you can literally drag and drop source code in the browser, and it will move it in real time in the DOM. So you can see some of these changes live. And this is really easy to do with a Bootstrap page because of the column and row nature that they have with their grid. If I go back to, I think I've got Bootstrap enabled here. You should be able to see this a little bit clearer with the Bootstrap example, but I have, let's see here. I'm going to see if I can get this row. So in this section, it's kind of hard to do with this compact view here. I've got this row here, and there's two sets of columns in it. So I've got this column and this one. I can move these around in the DOM, and I can swap those in real time. So if I'm prototyping, this type of scenario is pretty amazing, because I can just come into this I can have a user or a client sitting with me and say, do you like this layout better or this layout better? Do you like the column on the left? Or do you like the column on the right? Which one of these works better for you? And I can do this without changing any of my code even. I'm just in the DOM moving elements from left to right by a quick drag and drop. So prototyping is absolutely a plus with things like Bootstrap. Can you save changes that you make when editing the DOM? This has been tried many times. There are tools that could allow you to do this. Those tools usually fall apart pretty quickly, and you end up needing to go back and modify source code. They can get a little bit cumbersome. I don't know if Google's still doing this. They used to have like a code spaces tool that was built into the browser that was aware of your source code and where to find the files to make edits to it. The problem is you come in and you move something around, and I know you should probably have something like Git, keeping a history on what you're doing anyway, but you make a mistake in here and it saves to your source code, and it does a lot of things unintentionally that you may not have wanted to do. So you might be in here just kind of prototyping around or something, and it's constantly saving changes. It actually gets a bit monotonous. That's my experience with it, but there have been tools that have attempted this type of a thing. So yeah, that's a great question as well. I think that's how we kind of got to the point of live reload and hot module reloading on the web. Is we saw that editing in the DOM, while kind of handy, isn't practical, but reloading that visual rapidly is a lot more practical and has most of the same benefit. So live reloading is similar to what we see in like CodePen, for example, where I'm in my source code, and let's pull up a different one here. I'm in my source code, for example, and I want this to go full height. I can come in and say that the height is 100% of the view height, and just by making that change, it instantly re-renders the DOM, versus the other way around where I'm trying to get the DOM to change source code. Is again, it falls off the wagon pretty fast. But having these live editing experiences is a little bit more practical, and they're a little bit easier to work into, like your Git history and stuff like that. Great stuff. We're at the top of the hour. I'm going to say thank you all for joining me. I know I promised this was going to be a Blazor Power Hour, and I went with HTML instead, but this very much applies to Blazor, in my opinion. Blazor layout components, you're not going to see them because this is an HTML thing. So if you pick up some additional HTML and CSS skills, your Blazor skills are going to benefit greatly. So I suggest checking out CSS Grid and Flexbox. And these things are very much compatible with things like the Telerik UI for Blazor. So you can create your CSS Grid layout, and then you can focus more on, grabbing something like a Telerik data grid and dropping it into one of those grid frames and having, a nice side-by-side view, master, detail, pages, all those things very, very easily, and spend a lot less time trying to write these specialized layout components. Let's see here. Yeah, you don't want the GUI to edit your code. Yeah, we've tried these things. Dreamweaver's one of the tools from the past. Yeah, those things, they're hard to maintain, those type of WYSIWYG editors, for lack of a better term. That's what they are. So definitely agree there on all points. So hopefully you guys all learned something about CSS Grid today and Flexbox, and can use that to again drive layouts and drop save component architecture for where it really belongs, with very complex things like data grids and file uploaders and all of that. Put your grid on the page and drop your components inside that grid, and you should be good to go. This is Blazor Power Hour. So this is my weekly show for Wednesday, and I do these shows every week, or at least I try to, unless we have another event that conflicts with this schedule. But we also have TJ Vantel, who is going to be on later this afternoon. He's going to talk about React. We have Alyssa Nicol, who is on here on Friday. She does a lot of UI stuff as well. You may see me join her from time to time. She's very proficient at JavaScript. She's learning C#. Very entertaining. Make sure you tune in to watch her, so smash the follow button on that. And I'm dabbling with doing some VR on this channel as well. So stick around. We're putting together some possible shows about doing some virtual reality development. I just need to hash out a schedule. I've got the tools and demo capabilities all ready to go. I just need to find a time of day to slot this thing in, and we can do like some power hour type of shows in VR. We've got a React developer here. Yeah, make sure you follow TJ. If you follow the show, you're automatically following TJ. But if you hit TJ up online, pop his name there in chat. You can find him on Twitter, and find his posts on blogs.telerik.com and things like that. So good coworker of mine and friend there. Make sure you check out his content. It's really good. So again, hopefully we've got VR content coming soon. We've got React, we've got Angular, anything web you'll find here on Code It Live, and you'll see me later this week on my channel as well. I'm going to try to do some the schedule's at Eastern Standard Time, or Eastern Daylight Time, however you want to say that. I'm going to try to do a show this Friday on my channel about what is happening with Preview 6 in Blazor. There is a brand new dynamic component that was added to the preview, so we'll do a little bit of tinkering with that on Blazor State Has Changed on Friday on my channel. So we'll see you all around then as well. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your week, folks. Take care.